I have led mercenary crews for 30 cycles, across 40 worlds, against every kind of enemy this galaxy has to offer. I have fought hive swarms that felt no fear. I have fought machine legions that never slept. I have fought creatures with 3 hearts and armored skin thicker than starship hulls. None of them frightened me the way that one human unit did, and by the end of this story, you will understand why every mercenary company in known space now checks a single detail before accepting a contract. Is the enemy human? And if the answer is yes, we ask a second question. Which unit? My name is Vec Thurai. I am Skarn, born on a world with 2 suns and gravity strong enough to crush a human flat if they were not careful. My people are broad, thick-boned, and slow to frighten. We do not startle easily. We are built for war the way some creatures are built for flight. When my father put a rifle in my hands, I was barely old enough to walk without stumbling. By the time I led my own company, I had already buried more friends than I could count, and I had learned to bury the grief along with them, quickly, without ceremony, because grief is a luxury soldiers for hire cannot afford. I tell you this so you understand who I was before that contract. I was not a coward. I was not inexperienced. I was not careless. I was, by every measure my profession uses, a successful and respected captain. My company, the Ashbound 90, had a reputation for finishing jobs efficiently and walking away with most of our people still breathing. Clients paid well for that reputation. We were not cheap, but we were reliable, and in this business, reliable is worth more than cheap. The contract came through a broker named Pharaoh Delk, a wiry little trader species called the Ithani, who handled deals for a mid-sized planetary alliance called the Corvain Compact. The compact was locked in a border dispute over a relay station and a small moon that controlled shipping lanes worth more credits than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. On that moon sat a garrison, human, small, recently deployed, according to every report Delk handed me, undermanned and undersupplied. I remember laughing when I read the file the first time. Human military forces were, at that point in galactic history, still something of a curiosity. Humanity had only been part of the wider interstellar community for a few decades. They had fought their way into relevance through sheer stubbornness rather than any particular technological advantage. Their ships were serviceable but unremarkable. Their weapons were effective, but nothing our sensors had not seen before. What they had, according to the rumors passed around cantinas and mercenary guild halls, was a strange reputation for refusing to lose gracefully. I had heard the stories. Everyone in this business had heard the stories. I did not believe most of them. Before I accepted any contract, I always walked the transport deck and looked at the soldiers who would be trusting me with their lives. That habit came from an old commander who trained me when I was young, a scarred veteran who told me that a captain who stops looking his soldiers in the eye before a contract has already started to lose them, even if he does not realize it yet. I kept that habit for 30 cycles, and I kept it the night before we accepted the Corvain Compact's offer, walking past rows of bunks where my soldiers slept, or cleaned their weapons, or spoke quietly among themselves about what they would do with their share of the payment once the job was finished. None of them seemed worried. Why would they be? We had faced far more dangerous-looking enemies than a handful of human defenders on an isolated moon. I remember sitting across from Delk in a dim booth on a trade station, the smell of fried protein cakes drifting from a nearby stall, and asking him directly if this contract was as simple as it looked on paper. He shrugged those thin Ithani shoulders of his and told me the compact wanted this handled quickly and quietly. No orbital bombardment, no scorched earth. They wanted the relay station intact and the human garrison removed with minimal collateral damage because they intended to occupy the moon themselves once it was clear. It sounded in every practical sense like the kind of job my company had done 100 times before. Land troops, secure key positions, apply pressure until the defenders recognized the odds and surrendered or withdrew. Most species understood odds. Most species, when faced with overwhelming numbers and no realistic path to victory, chose to live and fight another day. I should have paid closer attention to a small detail buried in the mission file. The previous contractor on this job, a mercenary outfit called the Grey Talon Combine, had pulled out of the contract entirely after their initial reconnaissance. Not defeated, not destroyed, they simply withdrew, forfeiting their deposit, and refused to discuss why. At the time, I assumed it was a pricing dispute or a change of leadership within the Combine. Mercenary companies dissolve contracts for all kinds of boring administrative reasons. I did not think much of it. I signed the agreement, took the advance payment, and began preparing my company for deployment. We arrived in the system 4 days later aboard our transport, the Long Reach, a converted freighter, armored and refitted for troop drops. My second in command, a Skarn veteran named Oren Bask, stood beside me on the bridge as the moon grew larger in the viewport. Gray and cratered, with a single cluster of low structures marking the relay station and its surrounding garrison. Oren had fought beside me for over a decade. He did not scare easily either, but I noticed him studying the sensor readouts a little longer than usual. "There is nothing here," he said. "No orbital defenses. No patrol craft. No visible perimeter fortifications beyond basic barriers. Either they are supremely confident or supremely foolish." I remember telling him it did not matter which. Confidence and foolishness both crumble under enough pressure, and pressure was something my company knew how to apply. We had 400 soldiers, armored transports, close air support drones, and enough firepower to level that garrison twice over if the client had allowed it. Against what our reports listed as fewer than 60 human defenders, this should have been, in the crudest terms of my profession, a formality. We began our approach with standard procedure: long-range scans, communication attempts, a formal demand for surrender broadcast on open channels, giving the garrison commander the opportunity to avoid unnecessary losses. This is not mercy exactly. It is efficiency. Dead defenders sometimes still manage to destroy equipment, sabotage facilities, or cost us soldiers we would rather keep. A clean surrender saves everyone trouble. There was no response to the surrender demand. Not silence exactly, because our communications officer confirmed the signal was received. Just no reply at all. No panic, no defiance, no negotiation attempt. Simply nothing, as though the message had been heard, considered, and dismissed as irrelevant to whatever the garrison intended to do next. Oren found that unsettling. I found it arrogant, and arrogance in a badly outnumbered enemy usually meant desperation dressed up as confidence. I ordered the first wave of scout drones down to the surface to map the garrison's defenses before committing ground troops. This is where the first true oddity appeared, small enough that I dismissed it at the time, though I have thought about it every day since. The drone footage showed the relay station clearly: prefabricated structures, a landing pad, defensive barriers arranged in sensible overlapping fields of fire, standard human military design, nothing unusual. But planted at the edge of the perimeter, visible from orbit if you knew where to look, was a single flag. Not a compact banner, not a warning marker, not any kind of tactical device our analysts could identify a purpose for. Just a plain flag on a metal pole, planted in open ground where any approaching force would see it clearly. Our intelligence officer, a nervous little veteran analyst named Koss, spent nearly an hour trying to determine what the flag meant. Some kind of psychological marker, he guessed. Territory claim. Cultural signal. He could not find any tactical purpose for it, and eventually filed it as insignificant to mission planning. I remember looking at that image for a long moment before setting it aside. There was something almost patient about it, as though it were not a warning meant to stop us, but a marker meant to be found later, after everything that was about to happen had already happened. I did not know what that flag meant yet. I would learn, in the days that followed, in ways I still do not enjoy remembering. But standing on that bridge, watching the moon rotate slowly beneath us, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. A small, cold thread of doubt, thin as wire, running through the confidence I had built over 30 cycles of war. I ignored it. That was my first mistake. I gave the order to prepare the first assault wave. Transports were loaded, soldiers armored and armed, drop pods primed for descent. Oren asked me one final time if I wanted to request additional reconnaissance before committing. I told him no. We had the numbers, we had the equipment, we had 30 cycles of experience against enemies far more scary on paper than 60 poorly supplied human defenders on a moon with no orbital support. Before I gave that final order, I walked past Grail, the young weapons specialist who would later ask me the hardest question of the entire contract, and I saw him checking his rifle for the third time in as many minutes, a nervous habit I recognized from my own early cycles as a soldier. I told him there was nothing to worry about, that 60 defenders against 400 of us was not a fight, it was a formality, and he nodded and forced a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. I did not think much of that exchange at the time. I think about it often now. I gave the order, the drop pods launched. I remember watching them fall through that gray, airless sky toward the silent garrison below, and I remember thinking, with the kind of certainty that only comes right before everything falls apart, that this would be over within a single day. I was wrong about almost everything that followed. But I was especially wrong about that. The drop pods hit the surface in a wide arc around the relay station, exactly as planned. 90 soldiers in the first wave, spreading out to secure the perimeter while our transports held position in low orbit, ready to send reinforcements the moment ground control confirmed the landing zone was stable. For the first few minutes, everything unfolded the way it always did. Soldiers moving in formation, scanning for hostiles, calling out clear sectors one after another. I stood on the bridge of the long reach, watching the feed from our lead squad's helmet cameras, and allowed myself a small measure of relief. Then the garrison responded, and I learned something about human tactics that no report had prepared me for. They did not defend the perimeter the way a sensible, outnumbered force should. A sensible force falls back to a defensible core, consolidates its strength, and makes the attacker pay dearly for every meter of ground. Instead, the human defenders spread out even further than we expected, using the terrain, the low ridges and shallow craters scattered across the moon's surface, to break our formation into smaller, isolated groups before we had even reached the outer barriers. It happened so quickly that our soldiers were fighting in pockets of 6 and 8 before anyone on the bridge fully understood what was happening. I want to be clear about something. This was not overwhelming firepower. Their weapons were not more powerful than ours. Soldier for soldier, in a straight exchange, my Skarn troops were physically stronger and better armored. What the humans had instead was a kind of coordination I had never seen from any species, mercenary or otherwise. They moved like a single organism spread across 60 separate bodies. When one position took fire, 2 others shifted automatically to support it, without waiting for orders, without hesitation, as though every soldier already knew exactly what every other soldier would do next. Oren stood beside me, watching the same feed, and I heard him mutter something under his breath that I will not forget. He said it was like fighting something that had already seen this battle before it happened. Our first casualties came within 11 minutes, not a rout, not a disaster, but a steady, methodical bleeding of soldiers picked off by defenders who never seemed to expose themselves for more than a second or two at a time. I ordered air support drones forward to break up their positions. Standard procedure against dug-in infantry. The drones found their targets, delivered their payloads, and for a moment, I believed the tide had turned. Then came the detail that still visits me in quiet moments, years later. One of our lead squads, moving to secure a ridge that our tactical display marked as a weak point in the human defense, walked directly into a position that should have been cleared by the drone strike moments earlier. It had not been cleared. Not entirely. 3 human soldiers remained, wounded, equipment damaged, clearly cut off from any hope of reinforcement or retreat. By every rule of warfare I had ever operated under, by every standard my 30 cycles of experience had taught me, Those 3 soldiers should have surrendered. There was no path to victory for them. There was no path to survival for them, not against a full squad of Skarn soldiers closing in from 2 directions. They did not surrender. They held that ridge for 6 more minutes, using every scrap of cover available, coordinating their remaining fire with a discipline that had no business existing in soldiers who understood, as clearly as we did, that this position could not be held. When the ridge finally fell silent, my squad had taken 2 more casualties, securing ground that a rational combatant would have surrendered without a fight. I remember asking Koss, our intelligence analyst, to review the recording and tell me what he thought had happened. He watched it twice before answering. He said the human soldiers had not been trying to win that engagement. They had known from the beginning that they could not win it. What they had been doing instead was buying time, holding a position for as long as physically possible, because somewhere behind them, other elements of the garrison were repositioning, and every minute those 3 soldiers held that ridge was a minute their comrades used to prepare something worse for the rest of us. That, I began to understand, was the pattern. Every human position we encountered behaved the same way. Not fighting to preserve itself, but fighting to serve some larger purpose that none of us could immediately see. It made every engagement unpredictable, in a way that no enemy in my experience had ever been unpredictable. You could not calculate their breaking point, because they did not appear to have one in the conventional sense. A Skarn soldier, a veteran soldier, nearly any soldier I had commanded or fought against across 30 cycles understood the concept of acceptable losses. There is a point, usually well before total destruction, where continuing to fight stops making sense, and disciplined soldiers recognize that point and act accordingly. The humans on that moon did not seem to recognize it at all, or if they did, they simply refused to act on it. I remember standing on the bridge during that first ridge engagement, watching the tactical display update in real time as our squad's position blinked from stable to contested to critical within the span of a few minutes. Oren called for a reserve unit to reinforce them, and I authorized it immediately, but even as the reserve soldiers moved into position, I noticed something in their approach that unsettled me more than the enemy fire itself. They hesitated, not from cowardice but from uncertainty, because nothing in their training had prepared them for an enemy that behaved this way. Soldiers who should have surrendered kept fighting. Positions that should have been abandoned held firm. Every assumption baked into decades of standard mercenary doctrine seemed to be quietly failing us, one small decision at a time, and my soldiers could feel that failure even before they fully understood its cause. By the end of the first day, we had secured roughly a third of our planned objectives, at a cost nearly triple what our projections had estimated. I pulled our remaining forces back to a defensive perimeter as night fell across that side of the moon, and I called a command meeting aboard the Long Reach to reassess. Oren was blunt, as he always was. He told me the numbers still favored us. We still outnumbered the garrison by a wide margin, our equipment was still functional, and our losses, while higher than expected, were not yet critical. He recommended a modified approach for the second wave, focusing overwhelming force on a single sector rather than spreading our advance across the whole perimeter, denying the humans the chance to use their strange coordination against isolated pockets of our troops. It was sound tactical thinking, and I agreed to it. What none of us accounted for was that the garrison's commander had been studying our tactics just as closely as we had been studying theirs. The second assault began at first light, concentrated entirely against the northern sector of the relay station's defenses, exactly as Oren had planned. For the first 20 minutes, it worked. We broke through the outer barrier, pushed the defenders back toward the central structures, and I allowed myself, again, that small, dangerous feeling of confidence returning. Then the garrison did something that, even now, I struggle to fully explain to species who have not fought humans directly. As our forces pressed deeper into the northern sector, believing we had the defenders on the retreat, a second group of human soldiers, ones we had not detected, emerged from concealed positions behind our advancing line. They had allowed us to overextend, had let us believe we were winning, specifically so they could strike at our flank and rear once we were fully committed. It was not a large force, perhaps 15 soldiers, but they hit us with such precision and speed that our advancing line, which had been pushing forward with confidence only moments before, found itself suddenly fighting in two directions at once, uncertain which threat to prioritize. Oren, watching from the command channel, described it later as watching a trap close on soldiers who had walked into it willingly, believing themselves to be the ones setting the pace of the battle. I ordered an immediate withdrawal from the northern sector. It was the correct decision, and it was also the first time in over a decade that I had ordered my company to retreat from an engagement before achieving any of its objectives. The withdrawal itself cost us more soldiers than the initial breach had, wounded soldiers who could not move quickly enough. A transport shuttle damaged during extraction, forcing its crew to fight their way to an alternate pickup point under fire the entire way. By the time our forces had fully disengaged and returned to the long reach, I stood in the medical bay watching wounded soldiers being treated, and I found myself doing something I had not done in years. I found myself questioning whether this contract had been a mistake from the very beginning. Koss approached me quietly while I stood there and told me he had spent the hours during the retreat searching mercenary guild records for any prior engagements against this specific human unit. He had found fragments, incomplete reports, mercenary companies that had engaged similar human forces in other systems, describing almost identical patterns of behavior, soldiers who fought past the point where fighting made tactical sense, ambushes sprung with patience that bordered on the inhuman, despite the very obvious fact that the ones springing them were human in every sense of the word. And in nearly every fragment he found, the mercenary company involved had eventually withdrawn from its contract entirely, often at significant financial loss, rather than continue engaging that unit. I asked him if he had found a name for it. He hesitated before answering, the way people hesitate when a piece of information feels heavier than it should. He told me the fragments referred to it only as the Hollow Line. No further explanation. No official designation we could find in any accessible database. Just those two words, repeated across scattered, incomplete reports from mercenary companies that, in every case Koss could find, had chosen to walk away from the fight rather than finish it. I stood in that medical bay for a long time after he told me that, listening to the quiet sounds of wounded soldiers being treated around me, and I felt that same thin, cold thread of doubt from the bridge return, except now it was no longer thin. It had grown into something I could not easily set aside. I spent nearly an hour that night reviewing the casualty list personally, something I did after every difficult engagement, because I believed a captain who stopped reading the names of the fallen had stopped deserving the rank he carried. Reading those 18 names felt different this time. Not heavier in grief, exactly, since I had buried far more soldiers across 30 cycles than this single contract had taken so far. Heavier in confusion, because I could not yet explain to myself why we had lost them, not to superior weapons, not to superior numbers, to something I still did not have a name for, something that lived in the way the enemy chose to fight rather than in anything they fought with. We had lost 18 soldiers in 2 days of fighting against a garrison a fraction of our size, and we had not yet come close to securing our primary objective. Whatever the Hollow Line actually was, I understood, standing there, that I did not yet know the true shape of what we were fighting. And somewhere deep in my chest, beneath 30 cycles of hard-earned confidence, a very old and very simple instinct was beginning to whisper that perhaps we should not find out. I did not listen to that instinct yet, not fully, not on the second day, but I would, before this was over, understand exactly why every mercenary who had faced this unit before me had chosen to walk away. That night, unable to sleep, I did something I rarely allow myself to do during an active contract. I opened a private channel to an old friend, a mercenary captain named Brogus Yell, who had spent nearly as many cycles in this business as I had, and whose company had crossed paths with human forces on 3 separate occasions over the years. I told him where I was, and what we were facing, and I asked him plainly if he had ever heard of the hollow line. There was a long pause before he answered, long enough that I thought the connection had failed. Then he asked me, in a voice quieter than I had ever heard him use, whether I had already engaged them directly, or whether I was still asking out of caution. I told him we had already lost 18 soldiers. He was quiet again for a moment, and then he told me something I have never forgotten. He said that in this business there are two kinds of stories about human elite units. The stories the guild halls tell for entertainment, exaggerated with every retelling until they sound like myths, designed to frighten new recruits. And the stories that veteran captains tell each other quietly, one-on-one, stripped of exaggeration, because the truth does not need exaggeration to be frightening. He told me the truth version of a story that had happened to a mercenary company called the Iron Vein, 5 cycles earlier, on a contract almost identical to mine. A garrison, a relay station, a small outnumbered human force holding a position of strategic value. The Iron Vein had gone in with nearly identical confidence to what I had carried onto that moon, and by the end of the first week, they had lost nearly half their soldiers, despite outnumbering the defenders more than 6-1. What broke them, Brogus said, was not any single battle. It was a pattern that emerged gradually, the same pattern Koss had already started to notice in my own engagement. The human defenders never fought as though victory was the goal. They fought as though their only goal was making the cost of victory unbearable for whoever was trying to take it from them. Every position they held past the point where holding it made any tactical sense. Every retreat they staged was not truly a retreat, but a repositioning meant to draw pursuers into worse ground. And when finally cornered, with no possible path to survival remaining, they did not surrender. They simply kept fighting, using every remaining resource, every last soldier, every scrap of equipment, until there was nothing left to fight with at all. Brogus told me the Iron Vein's captain, a hardened old Corvix commander named Salis Drain, had said something after that contract that spread through mercenary circles quietly, the way important warnings tend to spread. He had said that humans do not calculate the value of victory the way the rest of us do. Most species, when faced with a fight they cannot win, begin asking how much they are willing to lose in exchange for survival, and they set a limit, consciously or not, past which continuing to fight simply stops being worth it. Humans, or at least these humans, the ones trained into units like the Hollow Line, did not appear to set that limit in the same place, if they set it at all. They treated survival as secondary to the mission, and treated the mission as something worth any cost required to see it through. Brogus also told me something about Salis Drain himself that stuck with me long after our call ended. Drain had been, by every account Brogus trusted, one of the most disciplined and cautious commanders in the guild, a captain who had built his entire reputation on knowing exactly when to stop pushing an engagement. After that contract against the Iron Vein's human opponents, Drain reportedly retired from mercenary work entirely, not because his company had been destroyed, since enough of it survived to continue operating under new leadership, but because he told his officers he no longer trusted his own judgment about what a winnable fight looked like. A captain who has spent decades learning to read the shape of a battle, and who suddenly finds that shape unreadable, does not always recover from that experience, even when he survives it physically. I asked Brogus why. What could possibly train a species to fight past every rational boundary that every other species in the galaxy respected? He told me he did not fully know, but he had heard theories from other captains over the years, pieced together from scattered contact with human military culture. Humanity's history, apparently, was full of long, brutal conflicts fought not between disciplined militaries with clear rules of engagement, but total wars where entire populations were mobilized, where the difference between soldier and civilian sometimes blurred entirely, and where surrender was not always guaranteed to mean survival. Species with histories like that, Brogus said, tend to produce soldiers who do not fully trust the idea of a clean, honorable retreat. They train their most elite forces around the assumption that giving up is not actually a safe option, and so those forces learn instead to keep fighting past the point where every other species would have already stopped. I sat with that explanation for a long time after our call ended. It did not make me feel better. If anything, it made the situation feel worse, because it meant the behavior we were facing was not some strange anomaly, some unusual unit that had simply been trained oddly. It was, according to Brogus, closer to the deliberate result of a species that had learned, through painful experience, to distrust the very idea of limits. The next morning, I called a meeting with my senior officers to reassess our approach entirely. Oren was there, along with Koss, our medical officer, a calm and steady veteran named Prell, and our weapons specialist, a younger Skarn soldier named Grail, who had proven himself capable during the previous 2 days of fighting despite his relative inexperience. I told them what Brogus had shared with me, stripped down to its essential points. We were not facing a defending force that would break under pressure the way most defending forces eventually did. We were facing something that treated its own destruction as an acceptable cost of denying us our objective, and that fact alone meant every tactical assumption we had built our approach around needed to be reconsidered. Grail, to his credit, asked the question that mattered most. If they truly did not care about their own survival, what was actually stopping us from simply overwhelming them with sufficient force, accepting whatever losses that required, and securing the objective regardless of cost? It was a fair question, and I gave him the honest answer. Nothing was stopping us, in the purest tactical sense. We could, in theory, continue throwing soldiers and equipment at that garrison until sheer numbers overwhelmed whatever discipline and coordination the defenders possessed. But that approach carried a cost that mattered enormously in our profession, even if it mattered less to a fully funded national military fighting an existential war. We were a business. Our soldiers were not conscripts fighting for survival of their homeworld. They were professionals who expected, reasonably, that the risks of any given contract would be proportional to the payment involved, and that their captain would not spend their lives carelessly chasing an objective that had already proven far more costly than originally estimated. Oren put it more bluntly than I had. He said that continuing this contract at the pace we had been fighting it would cost us the company, not the garrison. Even if we eventually won, and he was not certain we would win with so few soldiers remaining and so much equipment destroyed that the Ashbound 90 would not survive as a functioning mercenary company afterward. We would have technically completed the contract while effectively ending everything the contract was meant to fund in the first place. I understood, sitting there, that this was the actual reason mercenaries refused to face human elite units, and it had almost nothing to do with fear of death, in the way most people assume. Every soldier in this business understands that death is a possibility in every contract they accept. What we do not accept, what our entire profession is structured to avoid, is fighting an enemy whose willingness to sacrifice everything makes the mathematics of victory meaningless. A mercenary company survives by winning contracts at a cost it can sustain. Against an enemy who refuses to acknowledge any limit to what they will sacrifice, that sustainable cost simply does not exist. You either walk away before the true cost becomes clear, or you discover it only after it is far too late to matter. Before that meeting ended, Prell asked a question that none of the rest of us had thought to raise. She asked whether it was possible the defenders were simply following orders they did not personally agree with, soldiers trapped by a command structure that demanded sacrifice regardless of individual preference, the way some species conscript their populations into wars they never chose. It was a reasonable question, and I did not have an answer for it yet. I only knew, from everything Koss had gathered and everything Brogus had shared, that whatever was driving the HoloLine's behavior did not look like coercion from the outside. It looked, unsettlingly, like conviction. I spent that entire day reviewing every piece of intelligence Koss had gathered, searching for any advantage that might change the calculation. I found very little to encourage me. The garrison, despite 2 days of losses roughly proportional to our own initial assault, showed no sign of weakening resolve. Our long-range scans detected continued movement within the relay station, continued repositioning of defensive elements, continued preparation for whatever we intended to attempt next. If anything, the defenders seemed to be growing more effective as the engagement continued, learning our patterns just as thoroughly as we had failed to learn theirs. That evening, as I stood alone on the observation deck watching that gray moon rotate slowly below us, Prell, our medical officer, came to find me. She had been treating our wounded continuously since the second assault, and she looked exhausted in a way that went beyond simple physical tiredness. She told me something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that entire contract. Among the wounded soldiers she had treated, several had described something unusual about their encounters with the human defenders during close engagements. Not cruelty, not excessive violence beyond what combat required. If anything, several soldiers described the opposite. Human defenders who, once an engagement was clearly decided, once a scarred soldier was disarmed or too wounded to continue fighting, had shown restraint that none of them expected from an enemy fighting with such desperate intensity moments before. One soldier in particular, a young trooper named Dessa, who had been wounded and separated from her squad during the second assault, described being found by two human soldiers who could easily have ended the engagement permanently. Instead, according to Dessa's account, they had stabilized her wounds using their own medical supplies, left her in a position where our recovery teams would find her, and moved on without a word exchanged beyond a brief confirmation that she understood she was not going to be harmed further. Prell told me she did not know what to make of it, and neither did I. It did not fit the picture I had built in my mind of an enemy who fought without limits. It suggested something more complicated. An enemy who fought with terrifying, boundary-erasing intensity in the moment of combat, and yet still operated somewhere underneath that intensity according to some code of conduct that governed how they treated an opponent once the fighting had actually stopped. I did not understand what that meant yet, not fully, but it planted a question in my mind that would not leave me alone as the third day of the contract began. If the Hollow Line fought without limits and yet still showed restraint toward a defeated, harmless enemy, then perhaps what we were facing was not simple recklessness or a lack of self-preservation instinct at all. Perhaps it was something closer to a very specific, very deliberate choice about what mattered enough to fight for without limit, and what did not. Whatever the answer was, I understood by the end of that third day that I would not find it from intelligence reports or second-hand stories passed between mercenary captains over private channels. If I wanted to truly understand what we were fighting, I was going to have to face it directly and ask. That opportunity came sooner than I expected, and in a way none of us had prepared for. On the morning of the fourth day, before I had given any order for a third assault, our communications officer alerted me to an incoming transmission from the surface. Not a distress signal, not a garbled emergency broadcast, but a clear formal request for parley, addressed directly to me by name and rank. I remember the strange feeling of hearing my own name spoken calmly through a human voice, knowing that voice belonged to someone I had spent 3 days trying to defeat. The request came from someone identifying themselves as Captain Daniel Voss, commanding officer of the garrison we had been fighting. He proposed a meeting at a neutral point roughly halfway between our forward position and the relay station's perimeter, unarmed, with a single escort permitted on each side. He gave his word, in the plain and direct manner I would come to associate with human military communication, that the offer was genuine and not a trap of any kind. I discussed the request with Oren for nearly an hour before deciding to accept. Every instinct built over 30 cycles of mercenary experience told me to be cautious, and I was. I brought Grail as my escort, both of us equipped with concealed defensive measures despite the agreed terms, because trust, in this profession, is something earned slowly and verified constantly. But underneath that caution was something else, a genuine curiosity I had not felt in a long time. I wanted to see, face to face, what exactly we had been fighting. The meeting point was a shallow crater, roughly midway between our lines, its floor scarred by 3 days of combat, littered with the quiet evidence of everything that had already happened there. Captain Voss arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a single soldier, a woman he introduced simply as Lieutenant Ellery. Both of them showed clear signs of the fighting. Voss carried his left arm stiffly, favoring an injury he made no attempt to hide or explain. Ellery's uniform bore scorch marks along one shoulder. Neither of them looked like soldiers who believed they were winning an easy fight. They looked like soldiers who had been fighting without rest for 3 days and intended to continue for as long as necessary. What struck me most, standing across from Voss in that crater, was how calm he was. Not the forced calm of someone masking fear, but something quieter and more settled than that. He spoke the way someone speaks when they have already made peace with every possible outcome of a conversation before it begins. He told me he had requested this meeting not to negotiate a surrender, because he made clear immediately that surrendering the relay station was not something he had the authority or the intention to consider, but simply to speak with me honestly, one commanding officer to another, about what continuing this contract would actually cost both our forces if it proceeded further. I asked him directly why his garrison had not simply retreated after the first day, when it became clear how badly outnumbered they were. Any rational defending force, I told him, recognizes when a position has become untenable and withdraws to preserve what remains of itself for a fight it can actually win. Voss considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his answer was quieter than I expected, almost apologetic in tone, though there was no uncertainty behind it at all. He told me that his unit did not measure success the way my company did, and he suspected that difference was the true source of everything that had gone wrong between us over the past 3 days. My company, he said, was here to complete a contract efficiently, at a cost proportional to the payment involved, and then move on to the next job. That was not a criticism. It was simply the nature of the work, and he respected it as a legitimate way to conduct war. But his unit had not been sent to this moon to win efficiently. They had been sent to hold this position for as long as it took reinforcements to arrive, and every soldier under his command understood, before ever setting foot on that relay station, that holding meant holding regardless of cost, because the alternative meant abandoning a position their command considered strategically irreplaceable. I asked him if that meant his soldiers were prepared to die rather than retreat, and he did not flinch from the question the way I half expected him to. He said yes, plainly, without any of the bravado I might have expected from a soldier trying to sound brave in front of an enemy commander. He said his soldiers understood the difference between a fight worth dying for and one that was not, and that his responsibility as their commanding officer was to make that distinction clearly for them before the fighting ever began, so that none of them would waste a single moment during combat wondering whether the cost was worth paying. That certainty, he told me, was not recklessness. It was, in his experience, the only thing that made soldiers effective in a fight they knew from the outset they were unlikely to survive unless reinforcements arrived in time. I told him that my own soldiers did not operate under those terms and could not be expected to. We fought for payment, not for some cause we had been asked to consider worth an unlimited cost. He nodded at that, without any judgment in the gesture, and told me he understood the difference perfectly well, and that it was precisely why he believed continuing this contract would end badly for my company, regardless of the eventual outcome on the ground. He explained it in terms I have carried with me ever since. He said that a mercenary company measures victory by whether the mission was completed at a cost the company can absorb and still function afterward. His unit, by contrast, measured success purely by whether the position was held long enough to matter, with no requirement that anyone involved survive to see that success. Those two measures of victory, he said, were fundamentally incompatible in direct combat, because his side would always be willing to pay a price mine could not sustain, for exactly as long as it took to make continuing the fight irrational for anyone thinking in terms of sustainable cost rather than absolute commitment. I asked him, somewhat bitterly, whether he took any satisfaction in explaining all of this to me so calmly, effectively telling me that my company could not win against his without destroying itself in the process. He told me no, and I believed him. He said he had requested this meeting specifically because he did not want unnecessary deaths on either side, mine or his own, in a contract that both of us now understood clearly could not end the way my employer had originally hoped. He told me that in his experience, and he made clear this was not the first time his unit had faced mercenary forces under similar circumstances, most professional commanders eventually recognized this same truth, usually after losses similar to what I had already sustained, and chose to withdraw from the contract rather than continue paying an unsustainable price for an objective that mattered far more to my employer than it did to my own company's survival. I asked him what would happen to soldiers who did not withdraw. What would happen if I chose, out of stubbornness or obligation to my client, to continue this fight regardless of the cost he was describing? For the first time in our conversation, something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not satisfaction, something closer to genuine regret. He told me that his unit would continue holding that position for exactly as long as necessary, and that every soldier under his command understood and accepted that this might mean fighting until none of them remained standing at all. He said this without exaggeration, without theatrical weight, in the same plain tone he had used for everything else in our conversation, and somehow that plainness made the statement far more disturbing than if he had delivered it as some kind of dramatic declaration. I looked at Lieutenant Ellery standing quietly beside him during this entire exchange, and I asked her directly whether she agreed with what her commanding officer had just told me. She answered without hesitation, and her answer has stayed with me as clearly as anything Voss himself said that day. She told me that she had made her decision about what this position was worth before she ever set foot on that moon, and that decision was not something that changed simply because the fighting had become difficult. She said the difficulty was, in a strange way, exactly what confirmed to her that the decision had been the right one, because anything easy to hold would not have required soldiers willing to hold it regardless of cost in the first place. I stood in that crater for a long time after that, saying very little, trying to reconcile what I was hearing with everything I had assumed about warfare across 30 cycles of experience. These were not fanatics. They showed no signs of the desperate, unstable intensity I associated with soldiers who fought without any regard for their own survival out of ideology or blind obedience. They were calm, thoughtful, clearly intelligent people who had simply arrived at a set of priorities entirely different from anything my profession operated on, and who had built an entire military culture around defending those priorities, without compromise. Before we parted, I asked Voss one final question, the one that had been sitting underneath everything else we discussed. I asked him why, if his soldiers were willing to fight without limit, several of my wounded had reported being treated with unexpected care once they were no longer combatants. I told him about Dessa and the 2 soldiers who had stabilized her wounds rather than leaving her, or worse, on that battlefield. Voss's answer to that question was, in its own way, the most important thing he said to me that entire day. He told me that his soldiers fought without limit against the fight itself, against the objective, against whatever threatened the position they had been ordered to hold. But that intensity, he said, had never been about the individual soldiers standing across from them. Once a Skarn soldier was no longer a threat to that objective, whether through injury, surrender, or simple retreat, the reason to treat them as an enemy disappeared entirely, and what remained, in his soldiers' understanding, was simply another living person who no longer needed to be harmed. He said that distinction, between the mission and the individuals fighting on the other side of it, was something his unit trained into every soldier as carefully as they trained marksmanship or tactical coordination, because a soldier who could not tell the difference between defeating an objective and needlessly harming a defeated enemy was not, in his view, actually disciplined at all. He was simply dangerous, in a way that served no strategic purpose and reflected poorly on everything his unit was meant to represent. I returned to the long reach that afternoon carrying something heavier than any wound I had ever taken in combat. Not fear exactly, though fear was certainly part of it. Something closer to a complete reordering of everything I had believed, walking into this contract, about what made an enemy dangerous. I had expected to face an enemy who was simply stronger, better armed, more numerous than reported. What I had actually found was an enemy whose true strength had nothing to do with any of those measurable things, and everything to do with a willingness to define victory in terms my entire profession was never built to compete against. That evening I gathered my senior officers once more, and this time I did not ask them for tactical recommendations. I asked them a different question entirely. I asked them whether, knowing everything we now knew, they believed this contract was still one our company could complete without destroying itself in the process. The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than any words could have. Oren was the first to speak, and he did not soften anything for my benefit, which is exactly why I had trusted him as my second-in-command for over a decade. He told me that if we launched a third assault with the intention of finishing this contract by force, we would likely succeed eventually, given our remaining numbers and equipment. But he did not believe the company that walked away from that victory would resemble the company that had arrived 4 days earlier. We would win the objective and lose everything the objective was ever supposed to fund, a hollow victory, purchased at a price that made the entire contract meaningless from a business standpoint, regardless of what our client technically received at the end of it. Grail, quieter now than he had been earlier in the contract, admitted that his earlier question about simply overwhelming the garrison with sufficient force regardless of cost now felt naive to him in a way he had not expected. He said that watching the recordings of the second assault again, knowing now what Voss had told me about his soldiers' willingness to hold that position to the last person standing, made the entire idea of forcing a decisive victory feel less like a tactical challenge and more like a slow, deliberate act of destruction against people who had already made their peace with what continuing to fight would cost them. Prell spoke last, and her perspective carried a weight the others did not, because she was the one who had spent 3 days treating the physical cost of everything we were discussing in the abstract. She told me plainly that she did not believe our medical resources could sustain the casualty rate we had already experienced for however many additional days it might take to finally overwhelm that garrison completely. She said continuing this contract was not just a question of company finances or professional reputation. It was a question of how many more of the soldiers currently under our care would not survive to see whatever outcome we eventually achieved. I sat with all of that for a long while before making my decision, because a decision like the one I was about to make carries consequences that extend far beyond a single contract. Breaking an agreement with a client, even one as dangerous and costly as this one had become, damages a mercenary company's reputation in ways that follow it for cycles afterward. Clients remember companies that walk away from difficult jobs, and future contracts become harder to secure once word spreads that a company chose to abandon a client rather than see a fight through to its end. But I also understood, more clearly than I had understood almost anything else across 30 cycles of this profession, that a reputation only matters if the company carrying it still exists to benefit from it. A mercenary company that destroys itself completing one impossible contract does not get to enjoy whatever reputation it earned in the process. There is no version of this decision that did not involve accepting some kind of loss. The only real choice available to me was which kind of loss my company could actually survive. I did not sleep that night. I sat alone in my quarters, running the numbers again and again, as though repeating the calculation enough times might somehow produce a different answer than the one Oren, Grail, and Prell had already given me. It never did. Every path I traced forward ended in the same place. A company so diminished by the time it finally secured that relay station that the victory would belong to nobody but the client who had paid for it, and even they would inherit a moon soaked in a cost far higher than the credits listed on our original contract. I thought about the soldiers sleeping in the bunks I had walked past 4 nights earlier, full of quiet confidence about an easy payday. I thought about how many of them would not wake up if I chose to press forward simply because retreating felt, in some old and stubborn part of me, like failure. I made the decision that night, and I gave the order the following morning. We would withdraw from the contract entirely, forfeiting whatever remained of our payment beyond the initial advance, and return to the Long Reach's staging point to begin repairs and recovery before accepting any further work. I contacted Pharaoh Delk personally to inform him of the decision, and I will admit I expected a difficult conversation, threats of reputational damage, arguments about breach of contract terms. What I received instead was something closer to quiet resignation. Delk told me, after a long pause, that I was not the first mercenary captain to make this call regarding a contract involving that particular relay station, and he suspected, based on everything he had heard over the years, that I would not be the last. He told me the Corvain Compact would need to reconsider its approach to that moon entirely, likely through direct negotiation or eventual withdrawal of their own claim, because in his experience, no mercenary force willing to operate within sustainable financial and human limits had ever successfully dislodged a properly committed human garrison from a position their command considered worth holding at any cost. I asked him, before ending the call, if he had known that when he offered me this contract in the first place. He admitted, quietly, that he had suspected it, based on the Grey Talon Combine's earlier withdrawal, but that his obligation to his own client had made it difficult to be as forthcoming about that suspicion as perhaps he should have been. I did not hold that against him for long. In this business, brokers survive by finding companies willing to take on risk, and it is ultimately every captain's own responsibility to assess that risk honestly before signing an agreement. I had failed to do that carefully enough at the very beginning of this contract, and 18 soldiers, along with dozens more wounded, had paid the price for that failure before I finally understood what I was actually facing. Before we departed the system entirely, I requested one final contact with Captain Voss, not to renegotiate anything, but simply to inform him directly that we were withdrawing, and to ensure our remaining wounded could be safely recovered from any positions still within contested territory without further conflict. He agreed immediately and arranged for his own soldiers to assist in locating 2 of our wounded who had been separated from their squads during the earlier fighting and had not yet been recovered. During that final exchange, brief as it was, Voss told me something I have thought about often in the cycles since. He said he did not consider our withdrawal a victory in the way I might have expected him to. He said the true measure of success, for his unit, was never about defeating an opposing force in some triumphant, decisive sense. It was simply about holding a position for as long as necessary until the actual threat, whatever larger strategic purpose this garrison was ultimately protecting, had passed. My company's withdrawal, he said, was simply one small part of that larger purpose being fulfilled, no different in his eyes from the arrival of reinforcements or the resolution of whatever conflict had made this moon strategically important in the first place. He was not gloating over having defeated a much larger force. He seemed, if anything, simply relieved that fewer people, on both sides, would need to die completing a contract that had already cost more than anyone reasonably should have been asked to pay. We departed the system 3 days later, after completing repairs sufficient for safe travel, carrying our wounded and our dead back toward territory where proper medical facilities and memorial services could finally be arranged. I will not pretend the journey home was an easy one. 18 soldiers did not return with us, and the weight of that loss settled over the entire crew of the Long Reach, in a way that took a long time to lift, if it ever fully did. Oren took the losses harder than he let anyone see, and I only understood how deeply it had affected him months later, when he quietly requested a transfer to a training role, rather than continuing to lead soldiers into contracts himself. Grail, by contrast, stayed with the company and eventually took Oren's place as my second-in-command, carrying forward a caution about accepting certain contracts that I have come to value more than I ever expected to when I first heard him ask that naive question about simply overwhelming the garrison regardless of cost. Dessa, the young trooper who had been treated and left safely for recovery by 2 human soldiers who could easily have ended her fight permanently, remained with the Ashbound 90 for several more cycles afterward. She never spoke much about that moon, but I noticed she carried herself differently in every contract that followed, quicker to recognize when an engagement had turned into something more than a simple exchange of fire, slower to assume that any enemy, however outnumbered, could be reliably predicted before the fighting actually began. I came to think of that shift in her as the most honest lesson any of us brought home from that contract, more honest than anything I could put into words myself. In the cycles since that contract, I have told this story many times, first quietly among trusted captains, the way Brogus once told it to me, and eventually more openly, because I came to believe that the lesson embedded in it was too important to keep confined to private conversations between veteran mercenaries. What I learned on that gray, airless moon was not that humans were somehow physically superior fighters, or that their weapons or technology gave them some decisive advantage our sensors had simply failed to detect beforehand. What I learned was something far more specific and far more relevant to why mercenary companies across known space have quietly learned to check, before accepting any contract, whether the enemy on the other side happens to be a properly trained human elite unit. The real reason mercenaries refuse to face units like the Hollow Line has almost nothing to do with fear of death in any conventional sense. Every soldier in this profession accepts that risk the moment they take up this work. What we cannot accept, what our entire business model depends on avoiding, is an enemy who has already decided, before the fighting even begins, that there is no cost too high to pay for the objective in front of them. Against an opponent like that, the entire calculation that makes mercenary warfare a viable, sustainable profession simply stops functioning. You cannot price a contract against an enemy who refuses to acknowledge that any price exists. You cannot plan a campaign around acceptable losses when your opponent has already accepted the possibility of total loss as a reasonable outcome, so long as the mission itself is completed. Most species, across this galaxy, build their militaries around the assumption that soldiers, and the commanders who lead them, will eventually recognize when a fight has become unwinnable and will act to preserve what remains rather than continue paying an unsustainable cost. That assumption is not weakness. It is, in most cases, simple wisdom, the kind of wisdom that allows civilizations and their military forces to endure across generations rather than exhausting themselves completely in a single overcommitted conflict. Human elite units, at least the ones trained in the tradition Captain Voss represented, operate outside that assumption entirely, and they do so deliberately, as a matter of doctrine rather than desperation. I do not say any of this as praise, exactly, nor as condemnation. I say it as the plain truth I learned at great cost, on a small gray moon that most of the galaxy will never hear about, against 60 soldiers who never intended to make history, and simply intended to hold a position for as long as their orders required. Whether that willingness to sacrifice everything represents the best or the worst of what a species can become is a question I am not qualified to answer, and I suspect reasonable people, human and otherwise, will continue debating it for a very long time. What I can tell you, with complete certainty, drawn from 30 cycles of experience and one contract that nearly cost me everything I had built across those cycles, is this. If you find yourself reviewing a contract, and the enemy listed on the other side of that engagement is a human unit with a reputation you have not personally verified, take the time to verify it before committing your soldiers to that fight. Ask other captains. Search the fragments, incomplete as they often are, of previous engagements against that unit, and if what you find matches even a fraction of what I found regarding the Hollow Line, consider very carefully whether the payment being offered is truly worth the price you may end up paying to collect it. Because somewhere out among the stars, garrisons like the one I faced are still standing exactly where their orders placed them, prepared to hold their ground for exactly as long as it takes, against exactly as many soldiers as it requires, regardless of what that holding ultimately costs them. And every mercenary captain who has learned that lesson the hard way, as I did, walks away afterward carrying the same quiet understanding that now guides every contract I choose to accept. Some fights are not won through superior numbers, superior weapons, or superior tactics. Some fights are simply not meant to be won at all, by anyone unwilling to pay a price that no rational combatant should ever be asked to pay. And when you meet a soldier who has already decided, calmly and completely, that they are willing to pay it, the wisest thing any of us can do, mercenary or otherwise, is recognize that truth before it costs us everything, rather than after. That is the real reason mercenaries refuse to face human elite units. Not fear of dying, fear of facing an enemy who has already made peace with dying, and chosen to fight anyway.